If I said the following statement to you, the release knob on a compressor is magical, would you nod and say, yep? Or would you make a confused face and say, okay? If it's the second one, this video is for you. Hey, my name is Joe Gilder. I'm going to use a snare drum as my example for today, but I'll actually share how this particular technique works on two other instruments as well. I'll talk about that at the end. Before we jump in, let me give you a quick overview of what compression is and what it does. I like to think of it in four terms, four knobs, four directions: up, down, left, right. Up, down, left, right, BA, select, start. Up is the threshold. That is a volume setting that can move up and down that tells the compressor at this level, if signal crosses this level, goes up above this level, I want you to start doing your compression thing. That's up. Down, that's the ratio. That's typically something like 2-to-1, 4-to-1. That says when you are compressing, how much are you going to compress? 2-to-1 is pretty typical. 4-to-1 is aggressive. Infinity to 1 is as high as it'll go. So it crosses a little bit and it doesn't let anything come out the other side. Kind of like a limiter. That's the ratio. So that's the down one. Up is the threshold, down is the ratio. Left is the attack. Once we start compressing, how quickly do we pull it down? How quickly do we snag that peak, for example, and to kind of smack it into submission? If it's a slow attack time, then the compressor kind of slowly ramps up to full compression. If it's a fast attack time, something like 1 millisecond or 0.01 milliseconds, it's going to move very quickly. This is how quickly, if I'm a compressor and my arms are compressing, a fast attack means I go wham, and a slow attack means I go wham, okay? And the final one is right, which has to do with the tail end of the sound. So the attack, the left, has to do with how quickly it attacks. The release has to do with how quickly it lets go once the signal drops down below the threshold. So if it's a quick release, it lets go quickly, and if it's not a quick release, it lets go more softly. And the release is where I want to focus our attention today. By the way, if you don't feel super confident with compressors, it might be because you reach for compressors too soon in your mix. One way to solve that is to use my 5-step mix philosophy. You won't actually touch a compressor till at least step 3 or 4. To find out more about that, go to 5stepmix.com. Okay, here's a mix I just finished recently inside of Studio One, and here is the snare drum sound. It's just a snare sample, nothing much to write home about, but here's the raw sound. Okay, and then I typically apply some compression and some EQ to the sound. So EQ sounds like this. Got it a lot brighter. It's a little thick, and now it's got some brightness to match with the thickness, but then I wanted to use some compression to really kind of squash it down. Can't go into all of what compression does to the sound, but let me just turn this one on and off, and you can hear what it's doing to the sound, okay? Here we go. Kind of feels like, especially if you watch the needle move, it's like the snare is starting to come, like hit you in the face, and then somebody pushes him back. It's like, well, back off you, and then it comes back in. So it's like it's got this kind of tight and contained sound, which just sounds nice in the mix. It was arguably a little bit quieter, so I can turn that up a little bit. Now, here's what I want to show you. This particular compressor is modeled after a famous analog FET compressor. The input and the output are kind of, the input is sort of our threshold knob. The output is our output volume. The ratio is here, 4-to-1, and here's our attack and our release. And release is where we're going to focus today. The release time on this goes from 1.1 second at the really long end and 50 milliseconds at the short end. So not super, super fast, but listen to what happens to the sound when I take this adjustment and I move it from here to here. Just that movement, going from here, which is probably, I don't know, 100 milliseconds maybe, I don't know, doesn't tell me, to here. You would think not a big difference in sound, but listen to what happens to the sound when I move this knob from here to here. I'm not going to tell you. I want you to hear it first, and better yet, leave a comment telling us what you hear. Listen to it. I'll let it play a few times. I'll switch it back and forth. You'll see me turn it off and then turn it back on. I'll do that a few times. Then pause the video, leave a comment telling me what you heard. Because I feel like just even getting to where you express what you heard, even if you're wrong, is helpful in learning how to become a better critical listener, which makes you a better musician, better mix engineer, better all of these things. So let's jump in. Here we go. What did you hear? It was a pretty big difference. Like, I think this is one of the, sometimes I give examples and I realize some people are like, I don't hear anything, which is totally fine, by the way. You'll get there. Chess masters, by the way, people who can look at a chessboard and can just with one quick glance can tell exactly what's going on and tell you exactly what the next best move is and how many moves until they get checkmate. They're not just born that way. They get that way by playing a lot of chess, looking at a lot of chess, doing a lot of chess puzzles. So in the same way, you can get to where you hear something, say, oh, I know exactly what that is. So don't be discouraged if you're not hearing exactly what I'm showing you. All right, so what did you hear? To me, there was kind of on the surface level, there was an obvious kind of difference in volume. It was louder when I went with the shorter release time. So when I went all the way to the right, it got louder. Let's listen to that again. And that's understandable because it's compressing less, right? If you watch the needle bounce, the needle is coming back to zero quicker, which makes sense. It's the release time. It's the back end, the right side of that waveform, so to speak. So it makes sense it would be a little bit louder. But here's what I find so unbelievably fascinating about this. Listen to if this is the snare sound that we have, we can hear it's got several components to it, right? It's got the snappy thing up front, and it's got kind of the tail of the sound. We can look at the waveform and see that that's true, right? This is the snare drum. This initial part is the loudest part that we hear the most, but then all this stuff is happening as well. Compression tends to bring out those quiet parts, but the release control lets us say how much of those quiet parts, especially the ones that come after the big transient, we want to hear. So what's happening here is as we go with a faster release, it's letting more of those back-end sounds back in. If the release is set pretty long, meaning it's kind of holding them down, then we have a big sound, and then the rest of the sound, the whoo, is held down and doesn't get to come back in as quickly. If we go with a quick release, then the back end of the sound comes back in sooner. So that's what we're hearing when we go down to the 50 milliseconds. The first one, and if we go even longer on the release time, you'll hear it's mostly snap with no kind of tail. And as we bring it up to the faster release time, we're reintroducing more and more of the tail of the signal. Listen to that. So the first three positions, it wasn't that different. It was a little subtle difference, but going from here to here, huge difference in sound. Now, the question might be, which one's better? Well, it depends on the song. That one, to me, sounds trashier, sounds more like a garage band. Like if I'm going for kind of not a pristine sound, but something that's kind of sloppy and that just has a lot of rockness to it, if that was a word, that may be the sound that I go for. If it's this song, for example, is a lot more of a ballad, it's a soft, chill song, I don't want all that. I kind of want it to be a pow. And so my setting for this mix was to put the release there. Nice little snap. We don't lose the tail end entirely, but it's kind of pushed back and put in its proper place. I've said in the past, I like to think of the release knob as kind of the tone knob of the compressor, but that's not super accurate because the tone knob on a guitar rolls off high frequency. So it's not really what it's doing. To me, it's maybe more accurate to call it a vibe knob or a clean knob, because when I roll that release time to the left and made it a longer release time, the snare drum sounded cleaner. And the faster I made that release time, the more sloppy the snare drum sounded. So if you find yourself working on something and you're not liking the tone of that snare drum, but you like maybe the front end snap of it, but the back end is wonky, go see what's happening with your release time. Maybe it's set super fast, so you're getting all that kind of garbage sound. Find there's going to be a spot on every mix where that release setting is just about right, where it tames the back end of the sound, but it doesn't maybe get rid of it entirely. Now, you may see some advice that says set your release time to the tempo of the song. So the snare hits, boom, and that it comes back by the time the snare hits again. I don't care for that. I do like my needle to come back before the next hit, but timing it to the tempo of the music, I suppose there's a situation where that might be cool and make sense. I don't care about that. I care about what it sounds like. And you heard the difference. Really fast sounded very different from just a little bit slower. Okay, so 2 other places where this release knob acts in a similar way. The first is obviously the kick drum, or even just your overall drum bus. Mess around with, if you've got some compression already, mess around with that release time. For a kick drum, it could take a kick from sounding like boom to sounding like boom, because it takes that back into the sound and controls it more. Second place where this works really well is on something like a bass guitar. It can take the sound of the bass and make it sound more kind of staccato, to where instead of sounding like boom, 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 it can sound like boom, 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 boom. Sort of. Or you can go the opposite direction, where maybe there's not a lot of sustain and you'd like some more. You can make it go from that more staccato to having more sustain and going boom, 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 boom. Some of that's a factor of the attack, but a lot of that's part of how the release works. But play around with that. I found on certain bass parts, when I really go in, if I'm not quite getting the sound I want, and the compressor feels kind of cool, but not quite there, messing with that release knob gets it to that sweet spot where I'm hearing it exactly like I want to hear it. Hey, that wraps up this video. Thanks for watching. If you haven't seen my rules of compression video, that would be a wonderful place to go next.